From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Cameron Barr, managing editor for news and features at the Washington Post, which is a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival. First, a word of gratitude to the co-chairman of the festival, David Rubenstein, and the many other sponsors who've made this event possible. If you'd like to add your support, please note the information in the program or the app. We will have some time today for questions, and I've been asked to remind you that those who query our distinguished guest will be videoed for the library's archives. Jon Meacham is a frequent speaker at this festival, a reflection of his eminence as a journalist and historian. I hadn't met him until yesterday, so I consulted Don Graham, who employed him for many years at Newsweek. Don pointed out that Jon is a former boy wonder. He became national affairs editor of Newsweek at 26, and by the age of 37, he had been named its editor. Those were not always fun years at Newsweek, especially in the time preceding the Graham sale of the magazine in 2010, but Jon excelled even in adversity. In Don's words, he was a wise, thoughtful, and successful editor of Newsweek under impossible circumstances. As Jon's colleagues will tell you, even in the earliest years of his ascent, he was wise beyond his years, much more capable of wry wit and ironic detachment than your typical, as we would say today, millennial. Week after week, Jon would replenish the building with new ideas, very often drawn from his deep knowledge of history and religion and literature. Sometimes boy wonders sputter or fail to deliver on the promise they exhibited at the dawn of their careers. Not Jon Meacham. His passage from journalism to book writing and publishing has been marked by distinction. The success of his 2004 book, Franklin and Winston, an examination of the friendship of Churchill and Roosevelt, helped him to emerge as a public intellectual. American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House was awarded the 2009 Pulitzer Prize for biography. More recently, Jon's book, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, was on the Times and the Post's Best Books of the Year lists. Jon is here today to talk about Destiny and Power, the American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush, a surprisingly intimate look at a sometimes underestimated occupant of the Oval Office. My colleague Carlos Lozada, the Post's nonfiction book critic, wrote that it pulls off a neat trick. It completes the historical rehabilitation of its subject by deepening, rather than upending, common perceptions of the 41st president. It is a book that asks us to consider, as we witness a contest between two widely disliked contenders for the presidency, the importance of personal honor in our leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, Jon Meacham.
Thank you, Cameron. I appreciate that a great deal. I feel a little bit more warmly received at this particular book festival than I did 8 years ago when I was here to talk about Andrew Jackson, who's had a rough couple of months, as y'all may know. But I was on my way to give my talk about Jackson, and a woman ran up to me, which doesn't happen enough as a basic rule, and said, "Oh my God, it's you." And I said, "Well, yes, you know." Existentially speaking, that's hard to argue with. She said, "Will you wait right here? I want you to sign your new book." And I said, "Yes, ma'am." Hand to God, she brought back John Grisham's latest novel. So, whenever I think I am a boy wonder who survived boy wonderhood, I remember that there is a woman somewhere in America with a forged copy of The Runaway Jury. So, memento mori, as the medievalists called it. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you all for being here. You are the reason, many of the reasons that a lot of us do what we do. in the lonely hours of footnoting and trying to make sure that you get everything right. You're the ones on our minds to make sure we maintain our covenant with you in terms of creating compelling, hopefully compelling, narrative nonfiction. I don't know if y'all have noticed, there's a presidential race going on at the moment. I just want to say right off the top, the movement in 25 years from George Herbert Walker Bush as the Republican nominee for president to the incumbent Republican nominee for president, George Bush, who could not talk about himself, to Donald Trump, to quote Henry Adams, disproves Darwin. So that's where we are. That's where we are. My view of President Bush is that culturally and temperamentally, and this is not a nostalgic point, culturally and temperamentally, he has more in common with the Founding Fathers than he does with this political generation. It does not mean he's a perfect man. We always learn more from sinners than we do from saints. He was driven by a consuming ambition to control the fates and destinies of millions, even billions of people. He made compromises along the way, and we'll talk about those. But at the end of the day, in his heart, he was about honor and service and duty. He believed at every point that he wanted those of us who came after him to say that he had always put the country first. And I think a fair-minded judgment suggests that he came as close as any mortal can do to doing that. And again, we'll talk about that. Now, the history of this book is somewhat interesting to you all, but because you're here, it means you're part of the broad dork caucus. And so I hope you have your cards. You get free library cards, and you have to watch C-SPAN in the doctor's office. But I think the key thing to understand about him comes from two biographical moments. And so I want to start there. On June 12th, 1924, he was born in Milton, Massachusetts. 18 years later, as a senior at Andover, Phillips Andover Academy, three things happened. He turns 18 years old, he graduates from Andover, and he joins the United States Navy, becoming the youngest flying officer in the Navy. He told me that he very much wanted to go into the service actually right after Pearl Harbor. He looked into joining the Royal Canadian Air Force because you could get into the Royal Canadian Air Force without graduating from high school. His father prevailed on him to wait another 6 months or so. In his inimitable way, when I asked him, well, why was the impulse there so soon after Pearl Harbor, President Bush said, it was a red, white, and blue thing. You know, your country's attacked, you get in the fight. On September 2nd, 1944, he's flying a mission over the Bonin Islands, over Chichijima, to take out a radio tower and a communications and supply point going back to the home islands. Ferocious Japanese flak. The plane, the Torpedo Avenger bomber, is hit. The wings of the plane go up in flames. The cockpit fills with smoke. He realizes that he's going down, but he keeps going. He keeps going over the island to take out the tower. He goes back out to sea. He tells his two crewmates to hit the silk, to bail out. He turns the plane so that they can do that. He turns back, and then he bails out. At this point, tragedy almost broke out. If you bail out of a plane, if you think about it, the plane doesn't stop. So the plane keeps going. He gashes his head on the tail of the plane. Another 6 or 8 inches, and he probably would have been decapitated. And that would have been the end of the story. He plunges deep into the Pacific. His life raft, fortunately, has fallen off nearby. He flops into the raft. He cries. He retches up the seawater. He realizes that his two crewmates have not made it. And at some point today, in Maine. They're in Maine for another 2 weeks. He will think about Ted White and Dell Delaney, who were the two men who lost their lives that day in his care. He was 20 years old and had two other men's lives in his hands. I think the farther we come away from that culture, the farther we come away from that generation, it's difficult to remember the immensity of that responsibility we put on remarkably young men. One of the many moments the president cried in the course of our interviews for this book. I interviewed him for 9 years for this. Sometimes it was like the world's worst wasp-on-wasp therapy. He would cry, I would cry, and then we changed the subject. Most of our debates were vermouth or, anyway. I asked him, what did you learn from this? And he said the chief question that came out of his mind about the war experience was, why was I spared? Why was I spared? I submit to you that in many ways, George H.W. Bush's frenetic journey from the autumn of 1944, really unto this hour to some extent, is driven by his eagerness, his need to prove that he was worthy of being spared when others were not, that he had to prove himself worthy of their sacrifice. It's an elemental drama, and I believe deeply that that's a big part of what has driven him. He came back to it at different times during the interviews, always with tears, always sort of late in a conversation. And the other thing about his speed in life is he has always been moving rapidly. This is a man who could play 18 holes of golf in 32 minutes. I played with him once, and my excuse was I was made nervous by Secret Service guys with submachine guns. That's a lot to blame for my game, but it's there. But it was a frenetic journey forward, always moving. In 1980, when he was running against Ronald Reagan for the Republican nomination, Bush was so excitable that he shook the hand of a department store mannequin in a department. Now, Lyndon Johnson would have tried to register that mannequin. And God only knows what Bill Clinton might have done. So, always headlong, always looking forward, always moving to the next thing, looking forward, looking forward. I've never met a man at that level of politics with so little interest, actually, in how history would view him. He believed that he got some things right, some things wrong, and that people like me and those who come after me will have to make our best decisions. And there's a level of confidence in that. I would also submit that the values and the vision in many ways, the character and the ambient dignity that the Bush family brought to our national politics is something that we are in woefully short supply as we enter the fall of 2016. And recovering some of that dignity will be one step toward a saner political life. The second thing that affected him deeply was the loss of his daughter Robin in 1953. They lost her to leukemia. She'd been born in 1949. George W. was born in 1946. Jeb had just been born in January, I think, of 1953. Robin was 4 years old. The Bushes had never heard the word leukemia until they heard the diagnosis in the Midland pediatrician's office in Texas. Remember, they'd come from Texas after Yale in 1948. When they moved to Odessa, Texas first, Mrs. Bush, his mother in Rye, was so convinced that they'd moved to the frontier that she would send her daughter boxes of soap because she didn't think that Texas had any. They moved to Midland. They get the diagnosis. The doctor says, with all sincerity, I think the thing to do is simply take her home, make her comfortable, and she'll be gone in a few months. George Bush, being George Bush, could not accept that. He walks outside, gets on a payphone, and calls his uncle, John Walker, who was the head of Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, Dr. Walker says, bring her up, we'll do what we can. She survived through some very difficult treatments through October, Columbus Day weekend of 1953. It was the great cataclysmic crisis of the Bush marriage and the Bush family life. It brought them closer together. As you all may know, many couples who lose a child drift apart. Interestingly, Mrs. Bush was strong when President Bush was weak, and he was weak when she was strong. He could not stand watching Robin be treated in the hospital. He couldn't stand the shots. He couldn't stand seeing her in pain, so he would bolt out of the room, leaving Barbara to maintain the order and the love in that hospital room in that hour. After Robin died, it was President Bush who would hold Mrs. Bush all night as she cried and sobbed for month after month after month as she tried to cope with this unimaginable loss. So I also asked President Bush, in the course of doing this, what did the death of Robin teach you? And he said without hesitation that life is unpredictable and fragile. Unpredictable and fragile. I'd submit that he led his life and he governed the nation in what Henry Kissinger once referred to as the most tumultuous 4-year period since Truman, with this tragic sensibility, with this sense that everything could end tomorrow, and that therefore you had to do the best you could today. You had to do everything you could to make the world a little better, because one could never be sure when everything would be taken away. I think these two experiences, not particularly well known, it's not Read My Lips, it's not Dana Carvey, are the things that really shaped the man who became the 41st President of the United States. A couple of things on the other side. My view of President Bush is that he was a much more effective politician than we give him credit for. Part of that is because his last political act only netted 37% of the re-election vote. He was running against Bill Clinton, who, as he once later said, was the Sam Walton of partisanship. Bush was, by 1992, President Bush was not in a political world he understood in many ways. There was the rise of reflexive partisanship. There was the rise of alternative media. Remember, before there was Twitter and there was Trump, there was CNN and Ross Perot and cable TV and Bill Clinton. As Mark Twain once said, history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And 1992 rhymes with 2016. Remember, Bill Clinton went on Arsenio Hall. George H.W. Bush thought Arsenio Hall was a building at Andover. And that's where we took Spanish. He had no idea. No idea. So he was just not, it was not his time. It had been 12 years under Reagan and Bush. We had not had more than 8 years of single-party rule since James Monroe, except for the Roosevelt and Truman era. So it was already a historical anomaly for him to be in power. But there are three things that he did along the way to amass power that were not wildly admirable. And my own view, my biographical view, is that he always redeemed himself. And that's what makes this tone, this level of conversation for my purposes possible. First one is he's running for the Senate in Texas in 1964, running against Rafe Yarborough, who was the great populist senator there. George H.W. Bush opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's not something we like to talk about, particularly not today in Washington, right? But in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of Dr. King, George H.W. Bush, who had won a House seat in 1966, representing the 7th District of Texas in Houston, votes for open housing. He goes down to Texas, to Memorial High School, for a ferocious meeting with his constituents, They were screaming things at him. They were using epithets that they shouldn't have used then and you sure as hell can't use now, saying, we didn't send you up there to help these people. And Bush stood his ground. He was 41 years old. He stood his ground and he said, I cannot countenance sending African American soldiers to Vietnam to fight for America and then say they can't buy a house in a given neighborhood. He quoted Edmund Burke, who said that your representative does not simply offer you a mirror of your will, but offers you his best judgment. And in that moment, he showed a measure of political courage that helped give him the strength to keep pushing on. He won the crowd over and he moved forward. The second thing that was not particularly admirable was the 1988 presidential campaign. Many of you in this room remember it. It was not high-minded. We talked about the Pledge of Allegiance. We talked about furloughs. We talked about flag factories and flag burning. It was a values campaign in many ways, and a lot of people thought it was unfair to the governor of Massachusetts. But what does Bush do after he wins that campaign? Immediately, the press conference after the election in the George Brown Convention Center in Houston, where he announces that Jim Baker is going to become the Secretary of State, he's asked about this. He's asked about the campaign, and Bush says, that's history. We're moving forward. He drew a direct line, somewhat to his political detriment, between what you said on the campaign trail and what you did as a responsible officer of government. He learned this, I think, in China when he was there. Remember, this is a man who was a member of Congress, the ambassador of the United Nations, chairman of the Republican National Committee, envoy to China, director of the CIA, vice president for 8 years. He never hosted a reality show, but besides that, he had every possible qualification for president. So he said that that it was history. What he learned in China was that he picked up a phrase from Mao that campaigns were about firing the empty cannons of rhetoric. The empty cannons of rhetoric. Interestingly, Ronald Reagan would never have said that. Right? Franklin Roosevelt would never have said that. They saw a connection between politics and governing, that if you did not run for a particular mandate, you would have trouble governing. And that happened in Bush's term. He did not run for a particular mandate. He ran as a particular man. His argument was highly personal. It was that he could be trusted with the affairs of others. My own personal reaction to him, one of the reasons I wrote this book, is that I had a very caricatured sense of him when he was president. I was an undergraduate through most of his presidency. I attended a small college in the university in Tennessee called the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. There may be one or two of you who are not familiar with it. It's best understood as a combination of Downton Abbey and Deliverance. And so my best friend in college was a man you all may have heard of. He's from Lynchburg, Tennessee. His name is Jack Daniels. And so I was a little fuzzy on a couple of things that unfolded. I thought the Gulf War was about Destin, Florida. So when I met President Bush, I had this kind of Dana Carvey view of him. But almost instantly, this is the late 90s, I realized that he possessed a quiet, persistent charisma. How many people here have met George Bush? Pretty good number. How many here have received a note from him? Probably a dozen people in this room. He has this ineffable sense of command. I had a teacher once who defined charm as the capacity to make others love you without their quite knowing why. And that's true of George Bush. There's something about him. It's why if you met him, you were with him. If you only knew him through television and the electronic media, you probably were not going to be as impressed. But as he once put it when he ran for president in 1988, I have 30,000 friends. And he did. Remember, George Bush saw life as one long reunion mixer. He was never happier than when he was, had a vodka in his hand and was playing horseshoes with somebody. Back to '88 quickly. So the campaign is a disaster. He comes in and he tries to build a culture of compromise and consensus. He's the last president to pass significant bipartisan legislation with significant majorities from pluralities from both caucuses. He passes the Americans with Disabilities Act. I had a young man walk up to me last night and say that he was a special needs kid, a young man, and that he thanked God every day for President Bush, because without President Bush, he couldn't have gone to college, because the accommodations for his test taking and making sure he got the help he needed would not have existed without the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the single most untraditional Republican bill you can imagine. Bush signed it because he believed it was in the spirit of fair play. George Bush is a man who, when he was a child in Greenwich, his nickname was Half-Half, because if he had a treat or a dessert, he would cut it in half and give the other half to the other kid. His brother said that he was born with an innate empathy. And there is something about, and as we head into next week and the next 40 days, which sounds biblical, and we may be facing a biblical thing, and the moon shall turn to blood. I don't see the lions and the lambs lying down together, but maybe in a swing state or two. But character is destiny. The Greeks were right. And policies change, circumstances change, but character tends not to when people reach the point of running at this level for president. And George Bush's character was always one, while driven by ambition, riven by appetite. He was delighted to, if he wanted to win, and if he won, the nature of reality was somebody had to lose. And that was just fine with him. But by God, he was always going to reach out right afterward and bring people together. Quick story on this. So in March of 1989, John Tower fails to become the Secretary of Defense. Bush reaches out to Dick Cheney, who was then in the House, to become the Secretary of Defense. That opens up a place in the House leadership. This is like a wing of the butterfly that produces a hurricane. Newt Gingrich runs for that job. A congressman from Minnesota named Vin Weber runs Gingrich's campaign within the caucus. The papers are full of stories about how George Bush's compromise and conciliatory approach is being directly attacked by Newt Gingrich's confrontation. This is a man who'd put out a memo to his Republican colleagues saying, use the following words to describe Democrats. Sick was one of them. Un-American. Outrageous. This was the opposite of the world that George Bush had grown up in. 3 of George Bush's best friends in Washington were Democrats. Lud Ashley of Ohio, Sonny Montgomery of Mississippi, and Dan Roskentowski of Chicago. Bush kept his locker in the House gym so that he could go up and play paddleball and sit in the sauna with the Democrats. That didn't bear much thinking about. But he wanted to be part of that conversation. He wanted to reach out because he believed with Franklin Roosevelt that the science of human relationships was absolutely essential to the art of politics. That was the air he breathed. So when Gingrich wins, Bush calls and asks Gingrich and Vin Weber, the guy who had run the campaign within the caucus, to come to the White House for a beer. They go up to the residence, they have a beer, and as Weber put it, only George Bush would have remembered to invite the guy who ran the campaign in the House. It was just a typical thoughtful thing to do. They have the beer, and Gingrich and Weber can tell that there's something Bush wants to say but isn't quite saying. That's a definition of being a wasp. And finally, as they're standing up, Weber says, "Mr. President, what is it that worries you most about us?" And Bush is relieved to have an opportunity to say so, and he says, "I worry that sometimes your idealism may get in the way of what I think of as sound governance." I want to repeat that at the risk of pulling a Rubio. I worry that sometimes your idealism may get in the way of what I think of as sound governance. And Weber said he always appreciated, Bush didn't say your ideology, your nuttiness, your purity, your inflexibility. He said idealism. He was giving them credit that they genuinely believed in the philosophical agenda in which they were trying to build a Republican House majority, which would in fact happen 5 years later. But what he wanted and what he didn't get was reciprocal credit that he was now the senior constitutional officer in the United States of America. He is the one public official, as Andrew Jackson pointed out, elected by all the people, and that he had a constitutional duty, a cultural duty to try to govern soundly, not simply score points to get to the next midterm, to help a given movement, to win partisan points. I know this sounds as though I'm discussing Thermopylae, but this was just 25 years ago, a quarter century ago, and this was his ambient reality, and he paid for it, right? He said, "Read my lips," in an uneasy marriage to supply-siders. He worried all the time he was going to have to break it. He had to break it in 1990. As he put it, he knew he was going to be dead meat, as only George Bush could say. Dead meat, you know. Dana Carvey, I told you, I asked him, how did he build his impression of George Bush? He said the key to doing George H.W. Bush was Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. Yeah, with 6 shooters. Yeah, not gonna do it. So I've spent a lot of time with these people. So to me, that's the key legacy, is that this is a man who did put the country first. It's President Obama's view. I interviewed him for this. He wasn't perfect by any means. It's arguable that there wasn't much to do in a second term, but I would suggest, given where we've come in the last 16 years, now 20 years since he left office, then we really need to consider recovering as best we can the virtues that were embodied in this particular man. The partisanship changed, the media landscape changed. It's not the world in which he in any way grew up or would have understood, but there are certain values that can be, I think, ultimately recovered. I did this book partly because President Bush and Mrs. Bush both shared their diaries with me. The president kept a diary through the presidency. He dictated once, twice, 3 times a week. It's a remarkable document. He talks into the recorder. You can hear the blades of Marine One. You can hear the engines of Air Force One. You can hear the coffee slurping, sometimes a martini or two. Sometimes he's just beaten down. Fascinating document. And to make sure I got the whole story, I asked Mrs. Bush if she would share her diary. And I will say that when President Bush 43 learned that his mother had decided to let me read his mother's diary, the reaction in Dallas was not warm. As he put it, that's not good for me. God knows what Mom wrote. But what I found was incredibly decent people. Again, not perfect, but these are the kinds of people that you hope ultimately end up leading the country. I want to close with this. I mentioned the death of Robin Bush. The George Bush I got to know is the one who I think is still not as well known as he should be, though I'm doing all I can. He's leading this wonderful retirement life. He's been in a wheelchair now for 4 years. He's suffering from a form of Parkinson's. I saw him 3 weeks ago. He still follows everything and is devastating. When he does speak, he's right on point. We were at lunch this summer, and Mrs. Bush was showing a bracelet that he had given her, and he looked at it and said, "I was a romantic devil." This was also shortly after the moment where, when he was jumping out of a plane at 90, he was going to land at St. Anne's, the parish in Kennebunkport near the house. And Mrs. Bush said, "It's a good thing that we're doing it at the church, because then we can just bury him right there." So they have been married for 72 years. 72 years. When I was out talking about the book last fall, I was with an audience, and down front there was a slightly older man with his wife, and I made that point. I said, 72 years. And the guy down front said, "Jesus Christ." I think he had a long ride home. That's a true story. He just couldn't get there. But this is the real George Bush. This is a letter he wrote to his mother in the late 1950s. It's about Robin's death. It's about Robin. At this point, George W., Jeb, Marvin and Neil have both been born. Doro has not been born. So that was 1959, so we think this letter was written in 57 or 58. It was found in his mother's papers. She died 2 weeks after he lost the election to Bill Clinton. And this is the George Bush that I got to know, and I hope you do too. He wrote, "There is about our house a need. The running, pulsating restlessness of the four boys as they struggle to learn and grow needs a counterpart. We need some starched crisp frocks to go with all our torn-kneed blue jeans and helmets. We need some soft blonde hair to offset those crew cuts. We need a dollhouse to stand firm against our forts and rackets and 1,000 baseball cards. We need a legitimate Christmas angel, one who doesn't have cuffs beneath the dress. We need someone who's afraid of frogs. We need someone to cry when I get mad, not argue. We need a little one who can kiss without leaving egg or jam or gum. We need a girl. We had one once. She'd fight and cry and play or fight like all the rest. But there was about her a certain softness. She was patient. Her hugs were just a little less wiggly. She'd stand beside our bed till I felt her there. Silently and comfortable, she'd put those precious, fragrant locks against my chest and fall asleep. Her peace made me feel strong and so very important. My daddy had a caress, a certain ownership, which touched a slightly different spot than the "Hi, Dad, I love so much." But she is still with us. We need her, and yet we have her. We can't touch her, and yet we can feel her. We hope she'll stay in our house for a long, long time. In the course of interviewing the president, I asked him to read that letter aloud to me in Houston. And long before he finished, he broke down with an extraordinary level of physical sobbing. So much so that his chief of staff, whose office was next door, came in, and she said, "Why did you want President Bush to do that?" And I said, "If you want to know someone's heart," and before I could finish my sentence, the president said, "You have to know what breaks it." Thank you very much. Thank you. We have some time for some questions here. How much time we got?
Yeah. John, I just finished your book, this book. Fantastic. I read a lot of history
Thank
of
you.
presidents. And there was one question, two little questions, one you answered. You said every other page when George Bush was home, he wrote in his diary. And I was going to ask, did he type it? But you mentioned he used the microphone.
He had a tape recorder that he
Yeah.
bought at sort of the staples of the era.
Right.
He didn't want it to be a government tape recorder. He carried it in his briefcase, carried it everywhere. He often did it late at night, early in the morning. He used the office in the residence, and he loved that study off the Oval Office and would often do it. He got up about 5 every morning. They would take the dogs out and then come in. They'd read about 5 papers, and then he would go down and do some dictation. Fortunately, he tended to do more in times of crisis than not, which for most diary keepers is the opposite. Part of the power of the diary, I think, is that he didn't really believe, it was part of his code, that presidents don't complain. They don't, as he put it, they don't whine about, oh, woe is me. You're just damn lucky to be there. And I think he said things to himself that he could not say to Mrs. Bush, to Governor Sununu, to Dan Quayle, to Boyd and Gray, the people of Brent Scowcroft, the people around him. And so I actually believe it's a therapeutic document. Yes. I'm going to publish a volume of the diary, but he has to be gone. The way he's going, I'll be gone first. So Don't wait up.
Yeah, related to my second part was, you sort of alluded to that. Throughout the book, you cite this, and it's his quotations from the diary, and I'm wondering, as a historian, do you ever have the opportunity to get into a deep person's mindset like that? How many, Andrew Jackson certainly didn't have a diary or whatever.
No, that would have required self-reflection.
Yeah. But I mean, it must have had a lot of impact on your personal feelings toward him and writing the way you wrote the book.
Thank you for saying that. Yes, I mean, the reason I did the book is because he offered me the diary and he offered to talk to me as much as I wanted. And if you do what I do, that doesn't happen much. Yeah. There are only 44 of these guys, and there aren't that many still kicking. So it was a remarkable historical opportunity. I feel very privileged to have had the chance to do it. I should say there were no conditions on the project. No one read it, no one reviewed it. The one exception was Mrs. Bush's diary, because it had so much personal stuff. She kept that diary from 1948 until this morning. She gets up at 5 o'clock every morning and writes in her diary. And several of her children said, please don't tell me what she said about me. But she was going to seal that for 50 years after she died. And people say, well, how did you get her to give it to you? And my technical historical answer, I don't want to overwhelm you with a highbrow answer, is I begged. But I accepted the one condition on the project, which was she wanted to see any direct quotations from herself, which, given a document that spans 70 years, I thought was totally reasonable. So I took her 90 pages of excerpts. We had a fascinating afternoon in Houston one day. She was reading along, and every once in a while she'd say, I was an opinionated 37-year-old. Ma'am, the apple doesn't fall far from the chronological tree. At 91, you're not pulling a lot of punches.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you. I just was interested in how you were kind of drawing comparisons between what's going on in the campaigns now and President Bush and how he conducted himself. And it's interesting on NPR, and I can't remember the analyst's name, unfortunately, but just on Friday, they were talking about there's, some people believe, a direct line from the Bushes and Lee Atwater and Karl Rove to what is now going on with Trump, only that during the Bush's era, and perhaps relevant to their personalities, their status, et cetera, that they did not say these things themselves. And now the difference is they used other people to kind of put these negative thoughts out in that would be politically advantageous to them. But they did use that as a tactic to win their elections, whereas now, Trump has taken it to another level, and he actually is the messenger himself, as opposed
Trump
to
needs no
leaving it to
subcontractors,
others.
right?
Right,
Yeah.
but I think that, the connection is very unfortunate, and I'm just wondering whether, you painted a very positive picture of President Bush. I was very disappointed about the Lee Atwater and the Willie Horton situation, so that comes to my memory, and I'm just wondering if, in your view, him as a decent man participating in that says something about the nature of our politics within the context of the American democracy, that it encourages decent people to do the wrong thing in order to achieve their objectives, or is this just, maybe you don't see it as that important, but I didn't get the sense from your comments today.
Yeah.
I haven't read your book, unfortunately, so I don't want to, say that you don't cover it, but I didn't get the sense from your comments today that you felt that was important. Thank you.
Right. What I tried to say is that when I talked about the '88 campaign, obviously we were talking about the furlough ads, the Horton ads, although the Horton ads were an independent expenditure group, and we can spend the next 3 hours on that. But you said something quite brilliant there, which is politics is not a pure undertaking. And if you want to amass power, to try to be in a position of influence when the crises of the age come, you are going to cut some corners. You are going to have some moments where you say and you do things, or you countenance things that are said or done of which you are not proud. And I don't think there's any doubt that the 1988 campaign has examples of George Bush and his apparatus pushing certain tropes that, on reflection and even in real time, are very uncomfortable and risk falling into fear-based politics. There's no question about that. To my mind, what redeems George H.W. Bush is that once he got power, he did everything he could to do good with it. So you didn't see that in the term. Without that redemption, it would be a very different story. Now, is there a direct line between, in fact, I would go back even farther. I mean, between 1968 and where we are, because some of the same people were in the campaign in 1968. Is the popular understanding of the Southern strategy come along? People have argued, is the Republican Party now dealing with a Frankenstein monster that has gotten out of control and now has orange hair? That's one of the questions. I'm a little skeptical of that argument in terms of a direct line. I think that we have to judge political figures on the totality of their lives and the totality of their records. And I believe that the country is better off because George Bush was president for 4 years. I don't think he was perfect. Unquestionably, the attack politics of the Southern strategy were used in his campaign. But, even I remember interviewing Bill Clinton about this, and he said, the thing about the Bushes is there's not a racist bone in their body. Michael Dukakis told me that he totally understood why Willie Horton would be used in the campaign. All this is in the book. So I understand the argument about the direct line. My sense is if you are looking for philosophical or moral consistency, looking at the American presidency or those who seek it is probably not the first place to look. So you need to look at moments on the totality of the lives where they manage to transcend those shortcomings. That's my view. Yes, sir.
You have probably answered this question, at least indirectly. I recently saw the play in Stanton, Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson, which
Yes.
is a parody of Jackson, and I think of our current campaign about unbridled populism and the manipulation of that populism. Do you see any parallels today?
Well, yeah, with Jackson and Trump, I've resisted this for a couple of reasons. One is that Jackson brought an enormous amount of experience. You can argue about whether it was good experience or not, but to the presidency. He'd been a judge, he'd been a senator, he'd been a general. And so the idea that, fundamentally, the choice that's being presented to us in the next 45 days or so is one between one of the most conventionally prepared candidates in American history and the least conventionally prepared. And I interviewed Mr. Trump about this. He makes no bones about this. This is not a partisan point. I should say, by the way, as well, I've voted for presidents of both parties. Expect to again. And so what I hope to see in terms of Trump and populism and that argument going forward is that we can take the energy, the anger at the globalization, the forces of globalization, and find some way to channel those into constructive reforms as opposed to finger pointing and blame casting on the other. And it is an inarguable point that the United States of America has become stronger in direct proportion to how widely we have opened our arms from the very beginning. And we are dynamic in proportion to people who come here. We are the only nation on earth where you can become an American simply by saying you want to be an American. We are not based on ethnicity. We are not based on religion. We don't have to be born into a certain tribe or clan. We are devoted to an idea. And I worry that the current populist trend, unlike the Jackson era, the current populist trend is trying to limit the definition of what it means to be an American. Yet that is ahistorical and dangerous.
Let me preface my question by saying that I have finished your book, sir, and it's a superb piece of work.
Thank you. That's enough. You can sit down.
One more thing. There is a
All downhill from here.
Okay. There's an aggregate ranking of the presidents
And thanks,
by
Dad.
historians.
I appreciate it.
And by historians and presidential scholars that places George H.W. Bush as 22nd among the presidents. How would you respond to that, sir?
It takes time. Oh, Jesus, right. That was Lee Atwater's ghost. It takes time. This was the earliest possible point to do this book. My friend Michael Beschloss has a good rule that it takes 25 years to really get a sense and let the passions cool. I think he'll rise up. I mean, one-term presidents have a hard time, although my fellow Tennessean, James K. Polk, had a pretty good first term, although depending on how you think about California, maybe not. So it's a tumultuous term, but I think when we look back on an existential nuclear struggle that ends peaceably, it took Reagan and Bush. I mean, to be honest, it took Democrats and Republicans and the people themselves from Truman forward to end the Cold War. But I think we were fairly lucky because I think that Ronald Reagan did things in the 80s that Bush could not in terms of setting a rhetorical example. And also Reagan as a great negotiator. Remember, he was the head of the Screen Actors Guild. He used to say, people think negotiating with Gorbachev is tough. They should have met Jack Warner. So I think that, and then Bush was able to come in and do things that I don't think Reagan would have been very good at. And so I think that number will go up. I really do. One irony, parenthetically, is it's going to be fascinating to watch over the next 20 to 30 years to what extent Bush 41's historical stock is on a seesaw or on a proportional lift with his sons, right? I think Bush 41, I know this, Bush 41 for a long time believed that his historical stock would always be on a seesaw with Reagan's, that he was an asterisk, as he put it himself, after Reagan. Because of the dynastic drama, it's going to be interesting to see, as people reevaluate George W. Bush, what that does to George H.W. Bush, because they did confront two similar problems in very different ways. Another complicating factor there is going to be, if we have Clinton dynasty stories, it's going to be like, you know, C-SPAN meets Lancaster and York. I mean, it's just going to go on forever. So, is that it? I want to thank you all very much, and everybody go out and vote.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.